Hello and welcome. I'm Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi, president of RespectAbility. RespectAbility is a nonprofit organization that fights stigmas and advances opportunities so that people with disabilities can fully participate in their communities and can contribute to making the world a better place. I'm going to quickly turn it to my colleague, Eric Asher, so that he can give you some logistical tips so that you can participate in an interactive way in this webinar. Eric?
Hello, everyone. This webinar on Facebook is on Facebook and on Zoom. For best accessibility, we recommend that you watch on Zoom. You can turn on the live captions with the CC button in your Zoom window, and you can ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A function in Zoom. I'm going to put in the chat box now a link to the live writing transcript in a separate window if you want that, as well as a link to download the slide deck and read the report in full. Back to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. For those who don't know, Eric really runs so much of our communications here at RespectAbility, where he does a terrific job. So Eric, thank you for setting up this webinar like you do so many of them. I am so thrilled to introduce Megan Buren to you. I've been able to work with Megan for literally around 20 years. She is one of the young stars in strategic communication. She's the president of Buren Research and Communications, and she has a really deep background in public opinion research, strategy, coaching, press relations, which is critical to helping her clients achieve their goals. She's focused on client-facing messaging and communications. By the way, she has trained a lot of people in how to do TED Talks and is really good at helping people get ready for public presentations. She previously was a senior project director for Luntz Global. She's worked with Fortune 500 companies and lots of nonprofit organizations, including RespectAbility. Buren has a master's in communications, culture, and technology from Georgetown, a BA in international studies, and she also studied at Ohio State, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa. She is a member of the Columbus 11, a part of Wexner, and is just really terrific. And so when we started RespectAbility, she did our very first research, and she has been involved in many research projects for us later. And the reason that we feel it's so very important is that, as Frank Luntz, who she used to work with, says frequently, it's not what people say that matters, it's what people hear. And so you have to be very careful in crafting your messages so that people will get the messages that are needed so that it will change hearts and minds. I know we have a lot of disability leaders on with us from workforce agencies, from Best Buddies, from lots of different great organizations. And I think we'll all learn something today from Megan Buren. By the way, again, the report is now online, so you can read the full report, and the PowerPoint is also online so that you'll have a copy of that later. Turning it over now to Megan Buren. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I think my favorite part is being called young. It's been a while, especially after working together for so many years, but I really do appreciate it. I was honored to be involved in taking a look back at all of the research that RespectAbility has done since its inception. And what's really so different about what RespectAbility does and the way in which they approach this topic is that it is research driven. And this isn't because I think it's a good idea or because Jennifer thought it's a good idea. It's because the research, the public opinion research of thousands upon thousands of people now in America have said this is the messaging that truly will work to win hearts and minds, to advance opportunities for people with disabilities. And we would be remiss if not to mention that a lot of this really can trace back to research that has been done in other areas as well. I know that Eric put in the chat feature the link to the full memo, And you can see research links in there to research that was done in the LGBTQ community, which has had large success, although obviously still a long way to go, but a lot of success in moving American public opinion over the past decade or so in a quest for marriage equality and others. And that keen focus on positive and inclusive messaging, you'll see throughout what we look at today in the area of disability. We are not an organization that has done research specifically on a lot of other marginalized groups, but we'll mention that it is critical to the work that we do in advancing opportunities for people with disabilities, and find that this same type of positive messaging will likely translate into other areas as well, because it isn't just about the LGBTQ community or disability or race or so many other areas. It's about really all of us succeeding together, all of our allies, all of our partners being accepted in a much more inclusive society with opportunities for all. And so with that said, we'll go through this PowerPoint, which is a look at research that we have done across sectors: philanthropy, Hollywood, Capitol Hill, the disability community, that demonstrates that it is positive messaging that really does work best throughout, across party lines, across age groups, across topics. And so this is a look back at the research that's been done collectively. All right, so many of you probably know 61 million people in America have disabilities. 1 in 5 people in America, that is, have a disability. We're talking about a large part of the American population. And even those who don't have a disability, many are connected to someone with a disability. So we know that there are many more out there who have a close friend, have a family member, and care about these people and these issues. I know that RespectAbility has done a tremendous amount of work in Hollywood and continues to do so. This is really important, that people like these and others are self-disclosing that they have disabilities. You can see more in the memo, but we know that one of the reasons that people are not having the opportunities that they should, and that they're not self-disclosing, is because of an underlying stigma and bias that is prevalent when it comes to people with disabilities. And the more that these people and others are out there and comfortable self-disclosing that they are people with disabilities, the more we see a possibility for that to shift. From the most recent research that was done, and this is coming from right before the election of voters, you can see that we would consider 42% of voting Americans in the disability community. So either they have a disability, or a family member, or a close friend. We'll start with employment, and in each one of these sections, you'll see a slide on methodology. I'm not going to stay there for a long period of time, but I know that you can download the PowerPoint in order to look more into that along with the memo. It will share with you when the research was done, how many people were involved in the study, if it was polling or focus groups, and that's the information that you can have in order to understand just the scale and scope of all of these different research studies. But I will mention, as I did before, that we're at this point 7+ years in, talking about thousands upon thousands of Americans that we've spoken to about these issues. So as I mentioned, this first one on employment was done right before the election. And what you can see is focus on the top message circled with the 80, that when we ask them if they agree or disagree with the statement, the top ranked one was, our communities are at their best when all people, including people with disabilities, have the opportunity to get skills, jobs, and succeed. Now, I'll mention that there are different ways that you can ask questions on a study like this. These were each asked individually, and you can see if it's a darker blue, it's strongly agree, and a lighter blue, not so strongly agree. So 80% of those polled strongly agreed with that statement. You add on those that not so strongly agreed, you end up with 92% agreeing with that statement. If you go all the way down to the bottom, you can see that it's still very, very strong numbers, right? 86% are saying that America's leaders should fight stigmas and bias that limit opportunities for people with disabilities. I would argue that if you had stacked these up against each other and asked them to pick their top choice, you would have seen a larger difference between the top and the bottom of this graph. And so it's important to keep in mind that while all of these tested well, right, 86% is still a fairly overwhelming number when it comes to polling, you'll see as we break it down on the back end that there really are differences between how these were perceived. So that you have the top two being the most positive of the messages, and then at the bottom would be more of a negative argument, and you don't see a huge difference. And while you do see support for both, you'll see the differences when we break it out between different groups. So here, those same messages broken out between African Americans, Latinx, Democrats, Republicans, all across the top are the way that different segments of the population answered that question. So still overwhelming support at the top and very high support at the bottom, but you can start to see differences. For example, voted Trump 75% for the top message, 60% for the bottom. So while you still have very high support, there's a 15% drop from the top message to the bottom message in terms of which one they agree with more strongly. So those are important things to keep in mind, because when we talk about stressing what is the most bang for your buck in terms of how do you win hearts and minds, we only have the attention of the people that we're speaking with for short periods of time, right? Increasingly less amount of time can we keep anyone's focus, because we're all bombarded with so many messages and so many different things throughout our day. And so making sure that when we have those opportunities to speak with people who aren't necessarily yet an ally or don't yet know enough about this issue, then we want to use our very, very best in our arsenal. And so that's why we focus on those positive messages that won the most support across the board at the top of the chart. I'll also mention that one of the segments that we include in the polling is making sure that we understand who are people with disabilities, making sure that people with disabilities are at the decision-making table, just like anyone else, which is that second message, is not just a talking point. It is something that we truly believe in and live and walk daily, whether it's about disability or really across the spectrum about race, sexual identity, gender. This is something that RespectAbility strives to walk the walk every day. But we make sure that this is a segment of the population that we're looking at, because we want to know it's not just, again, what's our idea, what does the disability community want to say about ourselves? And so that's one of the reasons that is so important. And we've pushed for polling, not just the polling that we do, but polling across the spectrum to include segmenting out that population so that we can get a better sense from outside polling as well about what our community thinks and believes. In the election, not surprisingly, and not new probably at this point, economy and jobs and COVID dominated the concerns of our voters. and the same among voters with disabilities, right? 24% COVID-19 and 22% economy and jobs. This is interesting in terms of making sure that we really are pushing for seats at the table and making sure that political candidates know that people with disabilities vote, and people with disabilities and those who care about them matter in elections and in politics. So the question is, how important is it to you personally that candidates treat people with disabilities with dignity and respect? And you can see those numbers split between voters, people with disabilities, and the broader disability community. And those numbers are on the rise from 2016 to 2020. And so that's an encouraging trend to see those numbers going up as well. And I know that RespectAbility has done a lot of work behind the scenes and publicly to make sure that elected officials know that we care and that we are watching. So you see 83%, right? Very important that candidates treat people with disabilities with dignity and respect. And it is a core value. And like I mentioned, those numbers have only gone up. There is a split between Biden and Trump voters, but still 77%, a very high number when it comes to nationwide voter polling. The research that follows right now, I want to provide a caveat. It is older employment research, and while all of the shared core values in America that hard work should translate to success are still critical to the messaging that works and is positive messaging about increasing employment opportunities, we did used to use the language of the American dream. And so you will see that referenced in older polling on employment. But there is more of a recognition at this point that the American dream is far more accessible to those who are white and privileged. And so the newer research focuses on those core values, but you'll still see that old lexicon in some of the earlier research. So this is 2014 research, and you'll see the top message. Again, this is when you ranked them up against each other. Our nation, I'm sorry, not ranked against each other, somewhat convincing and very convincing. Our nation was founded on the principle that anyone who works hard should be able to get ahead in life. People with disabilities deserve to be able to work to achieve the American dream just like anyone else. And so you can see very similar language to what we are using currently, but without the actual term of the American dream. And then the next top one is companies like Walgreens, EY, which was formerly known as Ernst & Young, AMC, and others have shown that employees with disabilities are loyal, successful, and help them make more money. If we find the right jobs for the right people, it can and does increase the bottom line of companies. So positive messaging around employment, still the positive values make for the strongest messages. And then you can see the other ones ranked in terms of the strongest message on this. The last one that I'll reference was specifically disability community research. This was a poll of 3,800 people with disabilities and people in the disability community, because we know that employment is critical, and it's also critical to people with disabilities, and they've shown that repeatedly in their views. When asked which is more important, that I have a job and am independent, or that there is a government safety net of benefits that I will be taken care of, 71% of people with disabilities that we polled said it was more important that they have a job and are independent. And that is a very large number, especially when numbers in the disability community around employment are still far too low, and we know it is far too difficult still to get the right job with the right wages. in the right careers. More than 3/4 of people with disabilities say that a job is important to their happiness. And we've seen repeatedly across industries and across topics that it's the attitude of employers that is such a large barrier. Still, that stigma and the attitude, not understanding the positive value of hiring people with disabilities, is the critical piece that we see as needing to change, in addition to policies and important work elsewhere. But this is the public opinion piece that we need to move in order to make real change in this area. We want to encourage people as much as possible to emphasize the strengths of what people with disabilities can do. And that's the focus that we see in this messaging here. That, you know, Stephen Hawking was a genius who happened to use a wheelchair, and people with disabilities can do so many things that that are right for them and help the bottom line of the company. I'll mention another caveat here in terms of messaging. Super talents is not a word that we have found in the disability community is appropriate. And so while this is still accurate in terms of the research that was done at the time, we would remove the word super and have done so in the memo that actually describes which research to use or which messaging to use. So using just talents instead of super talents in developing computer software on that top message. We really do want to emphasize what those strengths are. So we'll move from employment to philanthropy. Excuse me. And when you look at philanthropy, it might seem that this is one area that you would think would be ahead of other areas. It is unfortunately not what we have seen at this point. We see many organizations that are doing great things, but still a very, very long way to go. And while the will and intention may be there, there are still many steps forward that we hope our partners will take. When we ask why it is that organizations don't fully include people with disabilities, there is an honest assessment that there is overt or unconscious bias about people with disabilities. So again, we see that throughout the research across industries, the bias and the stigma, and also that no one specifically asked the organization to include people with disabilities and make it a priority as the next one, which I would say we're moving further and further away from that being the case or a reason that should be okay. And so we hope that that is less and less of a reason while we also work to decrease bias. In the same way that you see here, the numbers for disability are significantly lower than the commitment that organizations have made to diversity and equity and inclusion in other areas. And I mention this in no way to pit groups against each other. We think all of these numbers should be at 100%, but you can see still the difference between them, and the disability community has a long way to go in increasing those numbers and making sure that the philanthropic community is addressing inclusion that includes disability. There's a lack of training around the areas around learning about opportunities for diversity, equity, and inclusion around disability. You can see it down at 35%. 3/4 of the organizations have not made an intentional effort to recruit people with disabilities in as employment, interns, volunteers, or board positions. So again, a very long way to go. And I mentioned this gap between the will and the skill. There are relatively easy things that can be done in order to make their websites, their webinars, their live events, if we ever get back to live events, more inclusive. And you can see that we're just not there yet. But positive messaging, again, is what works, right? So what is the most compelling reason to include and increase opportunities for people with disabilities? Organizations are at their best when they welcome, respect, and include people of all backgrounds. This includes people with disabilities. And so you can see that that is the highest message, and we're down at 7% when it comes to a negative message, right? Only 1 in 3 people with a disability has a job. People with disabilities are twice as likely to be poor as people without disabilities. They're disproportionately impacted by issues of school suspension and dropping out, unemployment, homelessness, abuse, and on. And so again, the negative messages will turn off an audience. It's not even just that they don't work as well. They have the ability to turn off your audience, and that does not help any of us to take steps, right? So you can see those in a different setup here. And when we ask about different facts and information that we can provide to bolster the case of using those positive messages, again, we see the positive messaging, even when it comes out in a much more factual context. So studies show that 70% of people with disabilities want to work, and that the majority of young people with disabilities can get jobs and careers when they're given the right opportunities and supports. So that gets you 37%. And same with information about simple, free, or low cost accommodations, versus down at 3%, 32% of federal prisoners, 40% of people in jail, and the majority of women who are incarcerated have a disability. Is not going to help us to move the needle by just providing the negative information, despite the fact that it's true. Moving on to Hollywood, where we did qualitative research and focus groups. Words that work were again positive. What people see and hear impacts what they think and feel about themselves and others like them. Like Will and Grace and Modern Family helped to change perceptions of the LGBTQ community and increase in positive, diverse, and authentic portrayals of people with disabilities on television and film can help to end stigmas and advance opportunities for people with disabilities. If we want to increase inclusion of people with disabilities on the screen, there are easy ways to work towards that goal, and not every role must be a lead. Actors with disabilities could easily play roles that neither hide nor emphasize their disability. The doctor who uses a wheelchair, the waiter who has a prosthetic leg, the scientist who has cerebral palsy. Given that 20% of people have a disability, it is also only natural to include people with disabilities in crowd shots. So those are the kinds of words that worked with decision makers in Hollywood around increasing visibility of people with disabilities on screen. What did not work was focusing on the negative yet again. Minorities are under attack in America. Hollywood and the creative community need to stand up to make sure our communities are welcoming, respectful, safe, and inclusive of all people. Youth of color and immigrants with disabilities are at huge risk for the school to prison pipeline. There are 750,000 people with disabilities behind bars in America today. People with disabilities of all backgrounds need to see positive role models like them on the screen. We can lead by example. This type of phrasing and this type of information was far less effective at moving people, and was just far less effective. Again, focusing on the negative. Religion. Much of what we've done has been focused on the Jewish community, although we have done research in the broader faith community, again, you can see at 33.6%, we are a stronger community when we live up to our values, when we are welcoming, diverse, moral, and respect one another. We want our children, parents, grandparents, and other family and friends with disabilities to be able to have an equal opportunity to fully participate in our community. These are the words that are most effective in winning hearts and minds. Capitol Hill was really interesting research. We saw Republican Hill staffers and policy elite who hear from people with disabilities or constituents that are trying to ask something of their representatives every single day. And what became clear was that they've tuned out a lot of what they hear because there are so many people coming in with a different, as they termed it, sob story every single day. And if they were to get invested in every single person or every single cause that comes through the door, they just wouldn't be able to be effective. And so when we spoke with them about what it was that they needed to hear, it was positive, solution-oriented messaging, that going in with the need was far less effective than being a positive partner in pushing for policies that would be effective. So things that worked, I'm sorry, I should also mention that there was a large focus on fraud, and being able to discount that before continuing on in the conversation was important for them to be able to hear what you had to say. And so, as Jennifer said, it's not what you say, it's what people hear, and making sure that they understood that we are not people who are participating in any type of fraud in the disability system or in the benefit system was important to get that out of the way and off the table before they could follow hearing what it was that you wanted to achieve. So there's a longer messaging platform here on this, but that was one of the important things that came out of it, talking about how to enable more individuals to achieve the American dream, getting more individuals off of benefits into jobs and paying taxes. So that takes us through the research across philanthropy, religion, Hollywood, employment, Capitol Hill. And I hope, I'm guessing, because I feel a little bit repetitive at this point, that you have gotten what I mean in terms of really the research bears out that it is the positive messaging that is most important and most effective. And even more so that using the negative has the opportunity to actually turn off the audiences that we need to reach in the limited time that we have to communicate with them. So with that, I believe we are able to turn it over for questions, and I'm going to try and mess with the top of my screen here for a minute to make sure that I can see the chat at this point as well.
Thank you so much, Megan Buren. That was really a tour de force. I really appreciate it. I know you've got a couple slides at the end that just sort of give some summary statements. And so I don't know if you want to pull those up to sort of synthesize out of all the different messages that have been tested with philanthropy, with religion, with people on Capitol Hill, et cetera, what the sort of winning, impactful messages are. Do you want to showcase? There are basically 4 messages that I think you've synthesized it down to.
Sure. So these are key messages in the areas specifically around employment. It's probably too much to have them all on one page. So you can see here are the first 2.
Our communities are at their best when all people, including people with disabilities, have the opportunity to get skills, jobs, and to succeed. I want to just point out a couple things as we go through these summaries. The first is this all people. Megan, can you talk about the all people or the expression just like anyone else?
So that's the type of phrasing that we find to be most effective, because everybody should have this chance, right? It goes back to that same concept that we talked about in what are those core values of America, that if you work hard, you should be able to succeed, and that there isn't an initial limit on who that should apply to. And so that core concept of all of us, right? You, me, my neighbor, that person down the street, grandma, grandpa, that kid, everyone should be afforded these same opportunities. And that's the kind of language that really works, that it's across race, across identity, across gender, across ability, that everyone should have those opportunities.
Great. I know that this is really important because we've seen that some people push back from what they see as really being quote unquote identity politics, or, dividing a pie where, one group is trying to get a slice away from another group. But really, it's all about the pie needs to get bigger and bigger so that more and more people can have opportunities. So we see again and again that it's all people, that communities are at their best when all people, including people with disabilities. So you wouldn't want to cut out the all people. You wouldn't want to say our communities are at their best when people with disabilities have the opportunity. You have to start with the all people, including. And that's a really important part of the conversation. It's not that we're asking for special rights. This is something we learned from the gay community, that they used to, some people called it gay marriage, and then they called it marriage equality. By changing the lexicon, they got a lot more traction with their message. And people with disabilities bring unique characteristics and talents that benefit employers and organizations. So when you're selling, you're not selling that hiring someone with a disability is good for the person with a disability. You're selling the WIFM, the what's in it for me of your customer, that your customer, the employer, is going to get somebody who's talented. So talking about Stephen Hawking was a genius who happened to use a wheelchair. People with disabilities can work in hospitals, hotels, excel in computer programming, software development, and many other areas of information technology and other fields. I mean, just looking at the poet Amanda Gorin, who has learning disabilities and had a speech disability, be the star speaker really at the inauguration, really goes to show the talents of people with disabilities. And then I know you have two other messages you wanted to highlight. And those are our companies, including JP Morgan Chase, Starbucks, and Bank of America, have shown that employees with disabilities are loyal, successful, and help them become more profitable. If we find the right people for the right jobs, it can increase the bottom lines of all sorts of companies. It was really important that we saw in the research that you had to name drop, that you may have noticed in the earlier thing that we talked about specific people with disabilities who are talented that they've heard of Stephen Hawking, they've heard of Greta Thunberg, the climate activist who has autism, they've heard of Amanda Gorin, who's that poetess, that name dropping actual people and name dropping actual companies that are well-respected companies. Nobody thinks that JP Morgan Chase or Bank of America is out to do favors by hiring people. They know that those are for-profit companies trying to ask value. They're doing it not just because they want to be nice people. They're doing it because it really does help their bottom line. And the government policies that help people with disabilities and keep jobs are win-win, because they allow people with disabilities the dignity and final benefits of work. Those same policies also grow our economy and save taxpayer money. That it's for not just the people with the disabilities that we're doing it, but that we're also doing it for the country as a whole. So I know that there's questions if you want to close down the slides. And then Eric, do you mind explaining again how people can put their questions in, and then Megan can start answering the questions?
Sure. So people can submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window.
Great. I see, for example, that Kara is asking, do you recommend different messaging for internal and external communications between the disability community, happens to have a disability, seems to encourage distance this piece of identity. I see your point from the messaging perspective, but have concerns that same message to people with disabilities.
You know what? I think that's actually an interesting question, and it would maybe require more research in order to really parse out the differences. I don't think it would change internal or external communication. They happen to have a disability. It is not their only defining characteristic, and I do think it still demonstrates talent and disability together, and therefore helps to reduce stigma and make people more comfortable with self-disclosing about a disability. I don't think that it's just an internal versus external one, but I also don't think that we have done the research to actually parse out that difference. Jennifer, do you have something to add there?
No, I agree. And I will ask the next question, which is Chineri is asking, Megan, you mentioned emphasizing positive messaging. How do we balance stating the reality with emphasizing the positive messaging? And I also want to just stress that when you talk about negative, that the reason it's negative, it's basically that it's citing how challenging things are for people with disabilities. And since things are really, really challenging for people with disabilities, especially now during the pandemic with, so many people getting COVID or having access to food issues and whatnot, that there are some really, really dire situations. And it's very, very tempting to say, hey, I'm drowning here, when you're drowning.
I think recognizing the reality of the situation is appropriate, right? And it depends on the situation that you're in. If you're having a conversation about the need to increase employment for people with disabilities, I would stick with the positive messaging of everyone needing the opportunity to succeed and have those opportunities afforded to them. With, again, limited time, you have more bang for your buck sharing that kind of messaging than talking through all of the statistics of how bad the situation truly is. That said, when you are talking through a specific policy and you need to demonstrate what the situation is, I think it's fine and acceptable to say this is what the percentage is of unemployment in the disability community. It's a fact that needs to be shared in order to continue the conversation, but it wouldn't be the starting point and it wouldn't be the place.
Right. So Fred Jablin or Jabin is asking, is there data or research specifically around intellectual or developmental disabilities? Do you want me to take that one or do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, the only thing that I could add is that certainly in the research where we were specifically looking at people in the disability community, we asked what disability they wanted to self-disclose. And so we have a breakdown of some of that information, but there are obviously also difficulties in reaching that community for polling. And so there are limitations to what we do have.
So I will add that we
Jennifer?
did a lot of work around the TV series Born This Way. And so if you haven't seen it, it's on streaming, and I encourage you to watch the 22 episodes of young adults with Down syndrome, a diverse cast, including people who are African-American, Asian, Latina, etc., with Down syndrome, all of whom are grappling with this transition from sort of school to work and living as independently as possible. So we did a lot of research, particularly around people with Down syndrome and how to communicate about those issues. And what we found is that people have a lot of doubts that somebody with an intellectual disability can be capable. And so you have to be very, very specific in showing how to do things. So for example, if you talk about how a such and such supermarket and hires people with disabilities and that are intellectual disabilities. And this is the kinds of roles that they play. And these are the jobs specifically that they are doing. There is a company in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa that is a mini mart that has over 500 stores, and they have a position in 250 of their stores that is specifically where they've hired someone with an intellectual disability to stock shelves. And what they do is they have laminated instructions with pictures on how they want their shelves to look. Project Search, which is a very successful employment program primarily for people with developmental disabilities, also uses this breaking down tasks into simple multi-step process with the use of pictures. So when you're trying to get an employer to hire someone with an intellectual disability, the best thing to do is to figure out what is the task that they need done, and then to show them how other employers have successfully used people with disabilities to deliver on that task. Walgreens is a really great example of that, for example, supermarkets and others. So those of you being very specific because people have a hard time imagining this. And the expression is, if you see it, you can be it. And so we tried to show it on the TV show Born This Way, and there's going to be another series coming out soon that's not yet public, very, very exciting, really you have to demonstrate. If you talk about the companies that do it and you show them how they do it, we have on the RespectAbility website a number of different webinars from Project Search, and also RespectAbility is a hashtag maybe Eric can put in from the RespectAbility hashtag some of those examples, because when you want to name drop examples, it's very handy to have them at your fingertips. And so we have a series that you can see them. So the next question is, there are many social enterprises with inclusive workforces with up to 50% people with disabilities in their employment that are successful. What do you think about using these as positive examples for the majority of businesses that are not considering hiring people with disabilities? Megan?
I think it falls in line with exactly what Jennifer was just sharing, that when we have examples of this working in practice, working for people with disabilities and working for the companies, right? That both of those things we have to show in tandem, that it is good in general, and social enterprises are great at that, but making sure that they are also good for the bottom line is something that we need to include when we're trying to work with new companies and increase employment.
So great. And then Robert Goldstraw asks, I often read about employers claiming they'd like to recruit people with disabilities, but they don't know how or where to find qualified candidates. Any polling on how common that view is amongst employers as the reason why they don't?
Mm-hmm. So we definitely saw specifically that response. In addition to bias and stigma, we definitely saw that response in Hollywood. And I know that RespectAbility has made a lot of strides in that area in making sure that people with disabilities who want to work in front of and behind the screen are in front of the people that can actually hire them. And so I think there's actually been a lot of progress, still a lot to do. Specifically in Hollywood, we saw that come out of the research. We saw it in the philanthropy research as well, with foundations and organizations and not knowing where to find folks. And I think you would see the same in employment research in general. That falls more on the policy side. And I know that RespectAbility has done a lot of work in making sure that all of the partners that have the people who are the qualified candidates and the companies that want to hire them can be connected. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to speak more to the work that's been done in that area, but absolutely it is one of the things that we see come out of the research.
Listen, the research is very definitive from school that kids who go to a school that's inclusive, kids that go to like a public school that have inclusion programs, those kids who are not disabled, who have disabled students in their classroom, wind up with much higher attitudes and better attitudes about people with disabilities, because they're able to see that if they got their accommodations, that they were able to be accessible and inclusive and successful. There are a lot of schools, particularly private schools, that do not include students with disabilities. They actually exclude them from the student population. And so the students that go to schools that don't have kids with disabilities have more stigma about disability, because then they're left with sort of this Jerry Lewis telethon of, people with disabilities are just people you should pity, and they can't achieve. And so the more people are with people with disabilities, the more they're surrounded by people with disabilities, the higher their perception is that people with disabilities can be competent and can be successful. And that is very important. I will also say that a lot of employers are not accessible. And then they will say, well, now I've got an opening and I'm going to try and hire somebody for this opening, specifically someone with a disability. And they'll put in the job description, and it's very clear from the expectations of the role that they want someone with 8 years of experience in that sector. Well, guess what? There are no organizations in that sector that are accessible maybe to somebody who's blind. You have a lot of websites and computer systems that have not been set up with website accessibility for blind employees. So how are you going to have 8 years of experience if you can't get 1 day of experience because their computer system is not accessible, or they won't allow people to have accommodations for sign language, or you physically can't get into the building because you use a wheelchair and it's not accessible. And so there are all kinds of barriers. One of the key successes is to really look at the youth transition, so that you can start with the entry-level positions and let people who are highly skilled coming out of school get into those positions and build their school skills. But let's keep in mind that the majority of working age people with disabilities actually acquired their disabilities, and many of them had a lot of work experience prior to acquiring a disability. And now, with people able to work from home due to the pandemic, a lot of the accessibility issues, in fact, have gone away because people can now work from home. So the next question, sorry, I'm going along here. Alan Bergman asked, task analysis and systematic instruction are core evidence-based practices within customized employment that were developed by the late Dr. Mark Gold over 40 years ago. Who really are the slow learners, etc.? It is not the people with disabilities. We must insist that providers have competent, certified staff that adheres to the fidelity of the strategies of an individualized basis in collaboration with the employer. Alan Bergman is one of the leading disability employment and inclusion experts in the world. And Alan, you are absolutely right. And that's why the slide that Megan showed earlier on, that showed that employers aren't even putting captions on videos, which is so easy to do, that they aren't even doing that only 14% are doing that. That is really important, that yes, they're expecting their employees with disabilities to be competent, but the employees without disabilities need to have some competency in how to be inclusive, and that is really missing. Eric, maybe you can put on the chat the link to our 7-part series to help people learn how to be inclusive of people with disabilities, because we do have free webinars on all those kinds of issues. And I always am recommending that people go to askjan.org, which has so many different productive tools. Alex Gray is asking you, Megan, did you test messages around access as a general theme, such as access to childcare or housing, et cetera, and then tie that to disability to broaden the theme of access to not just being a disability concept?
So we have looked at, disability access in general. We focus a lot on employment. We've looked at access to religious institutions, and so just employment specifically that got more at younger ages in terms of children and access to the community, less so on housing and childcare and those issues. Although I will mention just one thing that came up at at the Republican Capitol Hill focus group when it comes to that there can be, especially among some segments of the population, some really strong pushback that we shouldn't minimize to the ADA. So while we know that it has done many, many wonderful things, a lot of times, you know, we heard comments come up about, well, my condo fees went up because somebody wanted an elevator put in and we didn't have a choice, and blaming the ADA. And so that I will just mention when it comes to things like housing and other areas, that there is a double-edged sword from a messaging perspective. While we understand, obviously, from a policy perspective, just how critical, just how critical that legislation is, that it obviously hasn't gone far enough to get to all of the equity issues that we want, but also recognizing the baggage that brings for some of your listening audience when referencing that legislation.
Leanna Hartmore asks in the Q&A section, does this research show how this translates to actual hiring rather than just opinions towards inclusion?
So we haven't personally tracked the employment, but Jennifer, I know that you guys have a lot of conversations with employers, with foundations, with actually taking this research and using it in order to make change. And so I think, you know, what's critical here, and what I mentioned earlier, is that those are conversations that need to happen, and going into that room and having that conversation just with what we think is a good idea is not the most impactful way to use the time in that room. And so the research that RespectAbility has done over the years, I know has been critical in those conversations and more impactful than it would have been if we just thought, we'll share what the problem is, or we'll share something that we think is a good idea. But Jennifer can talk more about taking that and using it in action.
Right. So first of all, Megan, this is just extraordinary, and this is going to have to be the last question due to timing. And I want to thank all the listeners, but I really want to get to the specifics of this question. So the bottom line of the research is that when you're doing communications, you need to be thinking about the WIFM, what's in it for me. And the me is the person who's your audience. It's not the person with a disability who you're trying to help get a job. Or if it's not you, if you're trying to get a job. If you want to convince somebody to hire somebody with a disability, the worst way to do it is to say, Johnny needs a job. Hey, only 1 out of every 3 people with a disability has a job. Johnny is poor. Johnny's going to lose his home. The more you talk about the challenges that Johnny has or the disability community has, the harder it is to place Johnny in that job. What you need to do is understand, what does the employer need? What are they looking for? What are the different tasks that are involved? And then, does Johnny have those skills, so that you can talk specifically about how Johnny has the relevant skills and here's how Johnny can do it. And then you can really up your game by saying, and here's a company like yours, an employer like yours that has hired people with disabilities. Here's an example of how they do it. And look how your competitor over there is cleaning your clock because they've hired people with disabilities and they're making more money or doing a better job because they are an inclusive employer. And now there are a number of studies, whether it's through Accenture study or other studies, and you'll see that in the memo. So I want to really give a flag that the PowerPoint that you saw is on our website. There is also a written report, and that written report links to, for example, this Accenture report that talks about these different assets that people with disabilities add. I will also give a really big shout out to a webinar that we have coming up with Oli Cantos. Maybe Eric can put the link in the chat, because Oli Cantos has written a really great set of tools to help job seekers with disabilities and people helping job seekers with disabilities find employment. And we have that webinar coming up very soon. And we have a lot of other tools on our website. If you wind up having additional questions, I hope you won't hesitate to email us. This recording will be in our website. We're happy to get back with you. We really consider you all our partners. Let me just say, Eric, thank you for the technology. I would like to thank Gabe for our sign language, and I'd like to thank our captionist. Megan Buren, you've been involved with research with us for several years now. I want to thank you not only for today's webinar, but for 7+ years of research trying to look at these issues. And I want to really congratulate you on this new report. So thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful day.